There's a certain kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Not the peaceful kind you feel on a Sunday morning with coffee in hand, but the heavy, uneasy kind that makes your skin prickle, like something big is about to shift. That's how it felt in the early 2000s, even if most people didn't notice it yet. The internet was growing fast. Information was spreading like wildfire, and trust in institutions, in experts, in each other, was beginning to crack in places. No one had thought to check into that changing world stepped a man with a famous last name and a mission that would surprise almost everyone who knew his family's legacy. He wasn't running for office. He wasn't leading a protest march. At first, he was just a lawyer who cared deeply about rivers, forests, and clean air. Someone who'd spent years fighting polluters and defending natural spaces. People respected him for that. He spoke with passion, carried himself with a kind of old-school dignity, and when he talked about the environment, his eyes lit up like he was describing something sacred. But then, slowly, his focus began to shift. It started with a single article, a piece he wrote that linked childhood vaccines to autism. The claim wasn't new. It echoed a now discredited study from the late 1990s that had already been retracted, its author stripped of his medical license. But this time it came from someone with a recognizable name, a Kennedy, a family synonymous with public service and American idealism. That gave the idea a weight it hadn't carried before. Suddenly, people who might have dismissed the theory as fringe nonsense paused. They listened, and some of them believed he didn't stop there. He began giving talks, at community centers, at schools, at conferences filled with worried parents. He spoke softly, often with a look of deep concern, as if he were revealing a secret too dangerous for most to hear. He talked about government cover-ups, about pharmaceutical companies putting profit over children's health, about how no one was asking the hard questions. To many in the audience, he didn't sound like a conspiracy theorist. He sounded like a whistleblower, and that's what made it so powerful. Because here's the thing about fear. It doesn't need proof to spread. It just needs a voice that sounds honest. And to a lot of parents, especially those who'd watched their child struggle with developmental challenges, his words felt like validation. They'd been told again and again that vaccines were safe, that the science was settled. But what if it wasn't? What if someone with nothing to gain and everything to lose was finally telling the truth? Of course, scientists pushed back hard. Pediatricians, epidemiologists, public health officials, they all pointed to decades of research involving millions of children. Study after study showed no link between vaccines and autism. The original claim had been thoroughly debunked. Yet facts alone couldn't quiet the rising tide of doubt, because this wasn't really about data anymore. It was about trust. And for a growing number of people, that trust was slipping away. He started writing books. One became a bestseller. He appeared on talk shows, not as a guest shouting over others, but as someone calm, thoughtful, almost reluctant to speak out, but compelled by conscience. He framed his stance not as anti-science, but as pro-inquiry. "I'm not against vaccines," he'd say. "I'm for safer vaccines. I'm for transparency." That nuance made it harder to dismiss him. It also made his message more persuasive. Online, his following exploded. Forums filled with parents sharing stories, swapping advice, warning each other about which shots to avoid. Social media algorithms designed to keep people engaged pushed his content further, because fear and outrage get clicks. Before long, what began as a personal crusade had grown into a movement. Not everyone agreed with him, but even those who didn't couldn't ignore him. And through it all, he kept returning to one idea: that ordinary people had been lied to, that powerful institutions couldn't be trusted, and that speaking out, no matter the cost, was the only moral choice. For years, this remained his lane: activism, writing, public speaking. He wasn't part of the political machine. He criticized both major parties. He called himself an independent, a truth-teller swimming against the current. Many admired him for that. Others worried that his influence was doing real harm, leading to lower vaccination rates, sparking outbreaks of diseases that had once been nearly wiped out. Measles, for example. A disease that used to hospitalize thousands of children every year in the U.S., had been declared eliminated in 2000 thanks to widespread vaccination. But by the 2010s, cases started creeping back. In some communities where vaccine skepticism ran deep, outbreaks flared up. Kids got sick, some ended up in intensive care. Public health workers watched in frustration as preventable suffering returned, not because the tools didn't exist, but because trust in those tools had eroded. Still, he rarely backed down. When challenged, he'd pivot to other concerns: mercury in flu shots, aluminum in childhood vaccines, the speed of vaccine approvals. He'd cite obscure studies or quote scientists who held minority views, presenting them as brave dissenters in a system that punished disagreement. To his supporters, he was a lone voice in a corrupted system. To his critics, he was cherry-picking data to fit a narrative that endangered public health. What made his story so complicated was the duality of his legacy. On one hand, he'd spent decades fighting for clean water, for indigenous rights, for ecosystems under threat. His environmental work earned real respect. On the other hand, his vaccine activism sowed confusion that had measurable consequences. You couldn't separate the two. And maybe that was the point. He wasn't a cartoon villain or a flawless hero. He was a human being, driven by conviction, blind spots, and the weight of his own family name. By the early 2020s, something else was changing. Politics in America had grown more polarized, more distrustful. The pandemic had shaken faith in institutions even further. People were tired of being told what to believe. In that climate, his message found new life. He began appearing alongside political figures, not as a policy expert, but as a symbol, a man who dared to question when others stayed silent. Then came the announcement no one saw coming. In early 2025, during the transition period after a heated presidential election, the president-elect named him as the next Secretary of Health and Human Services, the very agency responsible for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Food and Drug Administration, and National Vaccine Policy. The news dropped like a stone in still water. Ripples turned into waves. Doctors, scientists, and public health leaders were stunned. How could someone known for spreading vaccine misinformation be put in charge of the nation's health? It wasn't just ironic, it felt dangerous. Parents who had spent years trying to navigate conflicting advice now faced the possibility that the top health official in the country shared views they'd been warned against. Supporters cheered. They saw it as a long overdue correction, a chance to clean house in a bureaucracy they believed was captured by Big Pharma. Critics warned of a crisis in the making. Late-night comedians prepared their jokes. But beneath the headlines, something deeper was happening, a test of whether truth in the public square could survive when the messenger was both revered and reviled. But that's getting ahead of the story, because before the nomination, before the controversy, before the late-night segments and Senate hearings, there was just a man with a famous name, a deep fear for children's health, and a belief that he was the only one willing to speak up. Right or wrong, that belief changed everything. And it all started not with a policy paper or a campaign rally, but with a quiet voice in a crowded room, saying something that made people lean in and wonder if everything they'd been told was a lie. That's where the real story begins. Not with power, but with doubt. Not with answers, but with questions that wouldn't go away. And in a world hungry for certainty, sometimes the most dangerous thing you can offer is a whisper that says, "What if we've been wrong all along?" It was a cold January morning when the news broke. Quiet at first, then spreading like a spark in dry grass. A single tweet from a major news outlet, then another, then a flood of headlines. The president-elect had chosen Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to lead the Department of Health and Human Services. Not as an advisor, not as a symbolic figure, but as the actual secretary, the person who would oversee the CDC, the FDA, the National Institutes of Health, and every major public health decision in the country. For a moment, the nation seemed to hold its breath. In hospital break rooms, doctors exchanged uneasy glances over coffee. In university labs, researchers paused mid-experiment, scrolling through their phones with growing disbelief. In living rooms across America, parents looked up from breakfast and asked, "Wait, him?" Because by now everyone knew who he was, not just as a Kennedy, not just as an environmental lawyer, but as the face of a movement that had spent years casting doubt on the very science that keeps people alive. The reaction wasn't just political, it was personal. Imagine you're a nurse who spent your career giving vaccines to kids, watching them grow up healthy, knowing you helped stop diseases that once killed thousands, or a parent whose child survived cancer. relying on a carefully timed vaccine schedule because their immune system was too weak to fight off even a common cold, or scientists who spent decades studying how viruses spread, how immunity works, how trust in medicine saves lives. To all of them, this nomination didn't feel like a policy shift. It felt like a betrayal, but not everyone saw it that way. In other parts of the country, in homes where people had long felt ignored by Washington, where medical bills piled up while drug companies posted record profits, where government promises had repeatedly fallen short, this news felt like vindication. Finally, some said, someone who isn't afraid to ask the hard questions. To them, he wasn't a threat to public health. He was a truth-teller stepping into a system that had lost its soul. That's the strange thing about moments like this. They don't just reveal what someone believes. They reveal what we, as a society, believe about truth, expertise, and who gets to decide what's safe. The announcement came during the quiet stretch between Election Day and Inauguration Day, a time usually filled with transition teams, policy briefings, and low-key cabinet announcements. But this wasn't low-key. Within hours, medical associations issued statements. The American Academy of Pediatrics called it deeply concerning. The Infectious Diseases Society of America warned that public health must be guided by evidence, not ideology. Even some longtime political allies of the incoming administration expressed private doubts. Yet the president-elect stood firm. In a short press comment, he praised the pick as a fighter for the people, not the insiders, someone who won't let Big Pharma call the shots. It was classic campaign language, us versus them, ordinary folks versus powerful elites. And it worked. Supporters cheered. Fundraising emails poured in. Talk radio hosts hailed it as a bold move against a broken system. But behind the scenes, panic was setting in. At the CDC headquarters in Atlanta, staff began quietly updating emergency protocols, just in case. At the FDA, veteran regulators wondered if their years of rigorous safety reviews would suddenly be labeled bureaucratic red tape. Public health departments in states already struggling with low vaccination rates braced for more confusion, because leadership matters. When the person at the top questions the foundation of medical science, it sends a signal loud and clear that trickles down to clinics, schools, and kitchen tables. And then there were the kids. That's what kept so many professionals up at night. Not the politics, not the headlines, but the real, tangible risk to children. Diseases like measles, whooping cough, and polio don't care about your political views. They spread fast in unvaccinated communities. And in recent years, those communities had been growing. Not because vaccines became less safe, they hadn't, but because trust had eroded. Now, the man tapped to lead the nation's health agency was someone who had, for over 2 decades, fueled that erosion. It wasn't just about autism claims anymore. Over time, his concerns had expanded, questioning flu shots, HPV vaccines, even routine childhood immunizations. He'd called for informed consent in ways that sounded reasonable on the surface, but often implied that standard medical advice couldn't be trusted. He'd shared platforms with people who believed vaccines contained microchips or were part of population control schemes. Ideas so far outside the scientific mainstream they bordered on fantasy. He didn't always endorse those theories, but he rarely shut them down either. And in the world of misinformation, silence can be as powerful as agreement. So when the nomination dropped, it wasn't just scientists who worried. It was school nurses tracking vaccine exemption rates. It was pediatricians explaining again and again why shots matter. It was parents in rural towns where the nearest hospital is an hour away, knowing that one outbreak could overwhelm their local clinic. Still, his supporters saw something different. They saw a man who'd been punished for speaking out, labeled a conspiracy theorist just for asking questions. They pointed to his environmental wins, his legal battles against polluters, his advocacy for clean water. Why can't he care about kids' health too? They asked. And in a way they weren't wrong. He clearly believed he was protecting children. The tragedy was that his version of protection clashed with decades of medical consensus. The media scrambled to explain the stakes. News segments broke down what HHS actually does, how it funds research, sets safety standards, responds to outbreaks. Late-night hosts joked about alternative facts in the vaccine aisle, but beneath the satire was real anxiety. Because this wasn't just another cabinet pick. This was about whether science would have a seat at the table or be shown the door. Then came the first interviews. He appeared on a popular morning show, calm and composed. "I've never been anti-vaccine," he said, leaning forward slightly. "I've always said I'm pro-safe vaccine. There's a difference." He talked about wanting more transparency, better testing, fewer conflicts of interest in drug approvals. It sounded reasonable, almost noble. But experts listening at home winced. Because safe vaccine is already the standard. Every vaccine in the US goes through years of trials, constant monitoring, layers of review. The system isn't perfect, but it's one of the most rigorous in the world. The problem wasn't that he wanted improvement. It was that his past statements suggested the entire foundation was rotten. And now he was being handed the keys. As confirmation hearings approached, both sides dug in. Advocacy groups launched campaigns, some demanding the Senate reject the nomination, others urging them to give him a chance. Social media filled with dueling infographics, one side showing plummeting disease rates after vaccines were introduced, the other listing vaccine ingredients with alarming red circles around them. Truth became a battlefield and facts were just ammunition. But amid all the noise, one question kept coming up. How did we get here? How did a man known for spreading health misinformation become a top contender to lead the nation's health agency? The answer wasn't simple. It wasn't just about one person. It was about years of growing distrust, in government, in media, in institutions that once held unquestioned authority. It was about algorithms that reward outrage over nuance. It was about a healthcare system that often feels cold, confusing, and expensive, leaving people hungry for someone who gets it. And maybe, just maybe, it was about the power of a famous name in a world that still leans on legacy when it's unsure where else to look. Whatever the reason, the nomination had done something important. It had forced a conversation the country had been avoiding. About how we decide what's true. About who we trust with our children's lives. About whether passion and good intentions are enough when the stakes are this high. Because in the end, public health isn't abstract. It's not about data points or policy papers. It's about the kid who doesn't get measles because her classmates are vaccinated. It's about the grandmother who survives flu season thanks to a shot developed through years of research. It's about the quiet daily miracle of living in a society where preventable diseases stay preventable, because enough people believe in the science to keep them that way. Now, that fragile trust was being tested, and no one knew what would happen next. It was a Sunday night, the kind when most people are winding down, scrolling through their phones, folding laundry, maybe stealing a few quiet minutes before the week begins again. Then across millions of screens, a familiar face appeared. Sharp suit, raised eyebrow, that signature mix of dry wit and simmering frustration. The opening chords played, the audience cheered, and within minutes the room, both in the studio and in living rooms everywhere, knew this wasn't going to be just another comedy segment. This was something bigger. The host didn't waste time. He walked straight to the point. No warm-up jokes, no soft let-in. "So," he began, "we're really doing this? We're putting someone who spent 20 years telling parents not to trust vaccines in charge of the entire U.S. public health system?" The camera held on his face, half disbelief, half exhaustion, as if he couldn't believe he had to explain why this was a problem. What followed wasn't just satire. It was a masterclass in storytelling, wrapped in humor but built on facts. He didn't shout. He didn't mock. Instead, he walked the audience through the journey, step by step, of how one man's personal crusade had somehow led to a nomination for one of the most powerful health positions in the world. And he did it with a mix of archival footage, clear graphics, and interviews that felt more like conversations than lectures. He started with the basics. "Let's be clear," he said, standing in front of a simple whiteboard like a teacher trying to reach a confused student. "Vaccines work. Not kind of, not maybe. They work. Smallpox gone, polio nearly wiped out in most of the world, measles kept at bay until recently." Then he showed a map of the U.S. with red dots blooming in states where vaccine refusal had climbed. "These aren't random outbreaks," he said quietly. "These are choices. And now, the person who's helped shape those choices might be running the show." But what made the segment so powerful wasn't just the data, it was the humanity. He didn't just talk about statistics. He showed a clip of a pediatric nurse, voice trembling, describing holding a baby with whooping cough because the parents had skipped shots after watching a viral video. He played a short interview with a high schooler who'd survived a measles complication that left him partially deaf. "I didn't even know I wasn't vaccinated until I got sick," he said. These weren't actors. These were real people speaking in plain words about real consequences. Then came the part everyone would quote the next day. The host recreated a scene, simple, almost theatrical. A wooden table, 2 chairs. On one side sat a cartoonish version of a big pharma executive, played by a crew member in a cheap suit and fake mustache. On the other, a scientist in a lab coat surrounded by stacks of peer-reviewed journals. "Now," the host narrated, "some people act like this is the battle. Greedy corporations versus lone truth-tellers." He paused. "But here's the thing, they're not even in the same room." He explained how vaccine research is mostly done by universities, public health agencies, and non-profit labs, not drug companies. How safety monitoring happens long after a vaccine is approved, through systems like VAERS and the CDC's own tracking programs. How the idea that no one's studying this is simply false. There are thousands of studies involving millions of children across decades. "The truth isn't hidden," he said. "It's just not as exciting as a secret." And then he turned to the nominee himself. Rather than attack him personally, the host played clip after clip of his own words, sometimes contradictory, sometimes shifting. In one interview from 2005, he claimed vaccines caused autism. In another from 2015, he said he was just asking questions. In a 2023 podcast, he suggested the flu shot might weaken your immune system, a claim with no scientific backing. "It's not that he's evil," the host said almost gently. "It's that he's been wrong repeatedly about things that matter, and now we're being asked to trust him with the health of 330 million people." The audience didn't laugh much during that part. They listened. What made the segment especially effective was its tone. It wasn't smug. It wasn't elitist. In fact, the host went out of his way to acknowledge why people might be skeptical. "Look," he said, "the healthcare system is broken. Drug prices are insane. Doctors are overworked. And yes, sometimes institutions mess up. But that doesn't mean the science behind vaccines is a lie. Confusing those two things is like refusing to drive a car because you don't trust the oil company." He even addressed the emotional core of the issue. Fear. "Parents aren't stupid for worrying," he said. "They love their kids. They want to protect them. And when someone comes along sounding calm, citing studies, and saying, 'I'm just like you, I'm scared too,' it's easy to believe them. But feeling safe and being safe aren't always the same thing." Then came the kicker, a moment so simple it stuck with people for days. He held up 2 bottles. One labeled vaccine, the other labeled RFK Jr.'s claims. He poured clear water into the first. Into the second, he poured muddy, swirling liquid. "This," he said, pointing to the clear bottle, "is what decades of global science say. This," he said, gesturing to the murky one, "is a mix of half-truths, outdated data, and things that sound scientific but aren't. You wouldn't drink the second one if your life depended on it. So why would we let it run the Department of Health?" The studio fell silent for a beat. Then applause, slow at first, then roaring. By the end of the 20-minute segment, something had shifted. It wasn't just that people were informed, they were moved. Comments flooded in online. "I never really understood how serious this was until tonight. My cousin sent me this. Maybe now we can talk without yelling." Even some who'd supported the nomination wrote, "Okay, I see the problem now." The next morning, clips from the show were everywhere. Teachers showed it in health classes. Doctors shared it with patients. Public health officials breathed a sigh of relief, not because the problem was solved, but because someone had finally cut through the noise in a way that felt honest, not condescending, and perhaps most importantly, the conversation changed. Before the episode, the debate had been framed as free speech versus censorship, or establishment versus outsider. Afterward, more people started asking, what does this mean for my kid's school? For the next pandemic? For whether my elderly neighbor gets a flu shot? The focus moved from personality to policy, from ideology to real-world impact. The show didn't solve everything. The nomination was still pending. The Senate hearings were still coming. But it did something rare in today's media landscape. It made complex science feel personal. And it made skepticism feel understandable, but not excusable when lives are on the line. And maybe that's the real power of storytelling. not to shout down the other side, but to help people see clearly, without shame, without jargon, just with facts wrapped in empathy. As the credits rolled that night, the host didn't end with a punchline. He looked straight into the camera and said, "We don't have to agree on everything, but when it comes to keeping each other safe, that's not politics. That's just being human." Then the screen faded to black, and somewhere, in 1,000 homes, someone paused their scrolling, thought for a moment, and maybe, just maybe, sent a text to a friend. Did you see that episode? The days after the late-night segment felt different, charged, like the air before a thunderstorm finally breaks. It wasn't just that people were talking. They were doing something. Petitions gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures overnight. Medical students organized teach-ins at universities. Parents who'd once quietly accepted vaccine skepticism in their social circles started asking harder questions at school board meetings. Even some local news stations, usually hesitant to wade into controversial health topics, ran special reports explaining how vaccine safety is monitored, step by step, in plain language. But the real shift happened in Washington. Senate offices, once flooded with generic form letters, began receiving deeply personal messages. Not just, "I oppose this nomination," but, "My daughter has leukemia. She can't be vaccinated, so she depends on the rest of us to protect her." Or, "I'm a retired nurse. I held children dying of measles in the 1980s. Please don't let us go back." These weren't political talking points. They were human stories, raw and specific. And they landed differently than any policy brief ever could. Then came the hearings. The room was packed, not just with reporters, but with ordinary people who'd flown in from across the country. Some wore buttons that read "Trust Science." Others held signs saying "Question everything." The nominee walked in calm, dressed in a dark suit, hair neatly combed, looking more like a professor than a provocateur. He smiled at supporters, nodded politely to critics, and took his seat at the long wooden table under the bright lights. What followed wasn't a shouting match. It was something quieter, and in many ways more unsettling. Senators on both sides asked direct questions. "Do you believe vaccines cause autism?" one asked. He paused, then said, "I believe there's evidence that deserves further study." That answer, carefully worded, technically not a yes, was enough to make public health experts in the gallery exchange worried glances. Because in science, further study on a thoroughly debunked link isn't curiosity, it's a tactic to keep doubt alive. Another senator asked about measles outbreaks. "In communities with low vaccination rates, we see children hospitalized," she said. "If you're confirmed, how would you respond?" He leaned into the mic. "I'd support parental choice," he replied. "And I'd investigate whether the current vaccine schedule is too aggressive for young immune systems." Again, it sounded reasonable, until you realize that the current schedule is based on decades of research showing exactly when kids are most vulnerable to each disease. Delaying or skipping shots doesn't make them safer. It leaves them exposed longer. But the most revealing moment came when a senator asked about his past statements linking vaccines to chronic illness. Instead of walking them back, he reframed them. "I've always said I'm not anti-vaccine," he repeated, a line he'd used for years. "I'm pro-transparency, pro-informed consent." The problem, as many in the room knew, was that informed consent already exists. Doctors explain risks and benefits before every shot. Consent forms are signed. The system isn't perfect, but it's there. What he was really advocating for wasn't more information. It was more room to opt out, based on fears not supported by evidence. Outside the hearing room, the tension spilled into the streets. Protesters gathered on the Capitol steps, some holding signs with photos of children who died from vaccine-preventable diseases, others waving flags and chanting about freedom. A grandmother stood quietly with a photo of her grandson, who'd survived a severe case of whooping cough at 6 weeks old.
"He was too young to be vaccinated," she told a reporter, voice cracking.
"He depended on the rest of us doing our part." That's not politics. That's basic kindness. Meanwhile, online, the debate grew even more intense. Supporters called the hearings a witch hunt, accusing critics of silencing dissent. Opponents warned that confirming him would be like putting an arsonist in charge of the fire department. Algorithms fed the fire, pushing the most emotional clips to the top, whether they were accurate or not. Misinformation spread faster than fact checks could catch up. Yet something unexpected also happened. A few conservative lawmakers, ones who'd previously avoided the issue, began speaking up. Not because they'd changed their minds about government overreach, but because they'd heard from constituents in rural districts where hospitals were already stretched thin. If measles comes back, one said in a closed-door meeting, we don't have the ICU beds to handle it. Even among those who distrusted federal agencies, there was growing recognition that public health isn't just about ideology, it's about capacity. And America's health system was fragile enough without adding preventable outbreaks to the mix. Back in communities, the ripple effects were real. In a small town in the Midwest, a school nurse noticed more parents asking about vaccine requirements, not to opt out, but to understand them better. They saw that segment, she said later. They realized it wasn't about being forced to do something. It was about protecting kids who can't protect themselves. In a pediatric clinic in the Southwest, a doctor reported a slight uptick in families completing missed shots. It's not a flood, she said, but it's a start. Still, the nominee's team doubled down. He appeared on friendly media outlets, framing the criticism as elitist and out of touch. They call me a conspiracy theorist because I question whether every single vaccine is necessary for every single child. He said during one interview, that's not conspiracy. That's common sense. To his base, it resonated. To public health workers, it was maddening, because common sense doesn't always align with biological reality. Viruses don't negotiate. Immunity isn't optional. As the weeks passed, the Senate remained divided. Key swing votes stayed quiet, weighing political loyalty against public outcry. Behind the scenes, negotiations intensified. Would he agree to recuse himself from vaccine decisions? Would he commit to following CDC guidance? His team floated compromises, but many experts saw them as empty promises, because leadership isn't just about specific votes. It's about tone, trust, the message you send simply by holding the office. And that message mattered more than ever. Because in public health, perception is part of the cure. If people believe the system is rigged, they won't show up for shots, for screenings, for pandemic precautions. If they believe the person in charge shares their deepest fears, even unfounded ones, they'll listen to him over their own doctors. That's the invisible power of this role. It's not just about policy. It's about persuasion. By late spring, the nomination was effectively stalled. No formal rejection, just silence. Delays. Further review. In Washington, that often means the writing's on the wall. But the damage, in some ways, was already done. The episode had exposed a fault line in American life. The growing gap between lived experience and scientific consensus. It showed how easily fear can masquerade as courage, and how hard it is to rebuild trust once it's broken. But it also revealed something hopeful, that when people are given clear, compassionate information, they often choose care over suspicion. One evening, after a long day of testimony, a young staffer from a senator's office stayed late, sorting through letters. Most were printed emails, but one stood out. A handwritten note from a high school student. I'm doing a project on public health, it read. I used to think vaccines were kind of scary, but after watching that show and reading real studies, I get it now. It's not about control. It's about community. The staffer pinned it to the bulletin board above their desk, because in the end, that's what this was always about. Not one man, not one nomination, but whether we still believe we're responsible for each other, and whether in a world full of noise we can still hear the quiet truth, that health isn't a solo journey. It's something we protect, together. By the time autumn rolled around, the nomination had faded from daily headlines, but it hadn't disappeared. It lingered in the background like a low hum you can't quite place but can't ignore either. Officially, it was still under review. Unofficially, most people in Washington knew it wasn't going anywhere. Too much pushback, too many red flags, too many doctors, nurses, scientists, and everyday citizens who'd spoken up and said simply, not this. But the story didn't end with a vote or a dramatic resignation. It ended the way so many modern crises do. Not with a bang, but with a slow, uneasy quiet. And in that quiet, something deeper settled in. A realization that the real battle wasn't about one person getting a job. It was about whether truth could still hold its ground in a world where belief often matters more than evidence. The nominee never fully backed down. He kept speaking, kept writing, kept appearing on stages where he was welcomed as a hero of free thought. His followers remained loyal, convinced that the system had ganged up on him just for asking questions. And in a way, they weren't entirely wrong. Powerful institutions had failed people before. Drug companies had hidden risks. Governments had made mistakes. But the danger wasn't in questioning those failures. The danger was in letting those failures become an excuse to reject all expertise, even the kind that saves lives. Meanwhile, in clinics and classrooms and community centers across the country, the work went on. Nurses kept giving shots. Teachers kept checking immunization records. Parents kept showing up, sometimes nervous, sometimes unsure, but willing to listen when someone explained things clearly and kindly. And slowly, very slowly, vaccination rates in some areas began to climb again. Not because of a new law or a viral trend, but because trust, once broken, can still be rebuilt, one honest conversation at a time. What surprised many wasn't the backlash against the nomination. It was the unity it sparked among people who rarely agreed on anything. Pediatricians and conservative pastors, urban public health workers and rural school boards, scientists and faith leaders. They didn't all see eye to eye on politics or policy, but they shared a basic belief that kids shouldn't get sick from diseases we already know how to stop. That shared ground became more important than ever when a new outbreak hit. Not measles this time, but a strain of whooping cough that spread fast through an under-vaccinated neighborhood. This time, the response was different. Local leaders didn't wait for Washington. They held town halls. They brought in doctors who spoke the community's language, literally and figuratively. They handed out flyers not with jargon, but with simple facts. This shot protects babies who can't protect themselves. And this time, more people came forward to get vaccinated, not because they were told to, but because they understood why. It was a small victory, but it mattered. Back in the Capitol, the HHS position eventually went to someone else, a public health veteran with decades of experience. No flashy name, no social media following, just a steady record of working across party lines to solve real problems. The announcement barely made the evening news, and that in its own way was a relief, because sometimes the best outcome isn't a dramatic showdown. It's a return to normal, where health decisions are made by people who study disease, not by those who profit from fear. But the episode left scars. Medical students now talk about the Kennedy moment as a turning point, the time they realized that being a good doctor isn't enough. You also have to be a good communicator. You have to listen to fears without judgment, explain science without arrogance, and never assume that facts alone will win the day. Public health agencies started training staff in media literacy, not just epidemiology. They learned that in the digital age, misinformation spreads faster than any virus, and fighting it requires empathy as much as evidence. And perhaps most importantly, people began to see that science isn't a wall, it's a bridge. It's not about blind obedience to authority. It's about a process: test, observe, question, revise. Real science welcomes scrutiny. What it doesn't welcome is cherry-picking data to fit a story that's already been decided. The late-night segment that had gone viral months earlier became required, viewing in some journalism and public health programs, not because it was perfect, but because it showed how to talk about complex issues without talking down to people. It reminded everyone that humor, when used right, can open doors that lectures slam shut. Yet the biggest change happened in living rooms, not lecture halls. Families started having different kinds of conversations. Not, "You're wrong," but "Help me understand why you feel that way." Not "Trust the experts," but "Here's what the experts actually say, and here's how we know." People began to distinguish between healthy skepticism and denialism, between asking questions and rejecting answers just because they're uncomfortable. And in that shift there was hope. Because the truth is, no one wakes up wanting to believe something false. People believe what helps them make sense of a confusing world. When institutions feel distant, when medicine feels cold, when the news feels like noise, it's easy to latch onto a voice that sounds like it's on your side. The challenge isn't to shame people for that. It's to earn back their trust by showing up, not as authorities, but as neighbors. As the year drew to a close,